Hello again, class. Today we're going to pick up with our series of lectures about the legislative branch. Today we're going to focus on the role and powers of Congress. I promise this lecture won't be as lengthy as our last one. This shouldn't be too long at all, actually. All right, so remember you have three branches: legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch. They each all have different jobs and roles and powers. Legislative branch, their primary job is simply to make the laws, to write the laws. While the executive enforces them, the judicial branch tends to interpret them. Legislative job is to initially write the laws. But because ours is a limited government, a government of limited powers, we have to look at Article 1 of the Constitution to find out exactly what type of laws Congress is allowed to pass. First, you have express powers. Okay? These are powers that are, quote, expressly or specifically written. All right, we touched on this when we dealt with federalism, so I won't go into it too much more here. But just remember, Congress has certain express powers, specifically those are 17 of the 18 things written down on the right of your screen. You see about 18 powers there in that chart. 17 of those are express. The other powers are implied. They're implied by number 18, which is the necessary and proper clause. The Congress can make all laws necessary and proper to the execution of any of the other express powers. This is also known as the elastic clause. Think about an elastic band; it expands, right? Well, the necessary and proper clause expands Congress's power to take on certain implied powers. And again, this should just be a review from our lesson on federalism, so I won't go too much further into the difference between express and implied powers. All right, so now let's talk about those powers that Congress has. What type of laws can Congress write? In this first group, I'm going to call their finance-related powers. Okay? Now, it's a common saying that a government entity or government branch can have one or two types of power, either the power of the purse or the power of the sword. Well, the president in our government enforces laws. The president's in charge of the military. All right, so it's the executive branch that has the power of the sword in America. And so that leaves Congress the power of the purse. All right, and so what do you keep in a purse? You keep money in a purse. Okay, and so a lot of Congress's powers are financial related, and these include the ability to raise revenue. Something's interesting about this: all tax bills. Okay, so all tax bills, or what they also call revenue bills. All right, remember, revenue is money that kind of comes into an organization, or money that an organization makes. All revenue or tax bills must originate in a House of Representatives. Remember, Congress has two houses. You have the Senate and you have the House of Representatives. And although they both are charged with drafting the laws in our country, and ultimately to pass any law, both houses have to agree to it. But they have slightly different powers and responsibilities. And we'll talk about some specific things that only the Senate does later. But for right now, let's focus on the House of Representatives, because one of the great powers the House of Representatives has is that it and it alone can draft tax bills or revenue bills. All right? So even if all 100 senators want to draft some sort of tax bill, they can't do that unless the House of Representatives first drafts such a bill, or at least a similar bill. All right, so let me pause right here. I think I mentioned this in our last one, just in case not. Remember, a bill is simply a proposed law. Okay? Once it is passed and signed by the president, then it becomes a law. Before that, we call it a bill. All right, and so if the government wants to raise money, it has to start with the House of Representatives passing a tax bill or a revenue bill. Congress is also given the task of appropriation bills or appropriating money. This basically means Congress decides where, when, and on what the government spends money. Okay? How money is appropriated, how it is spent, what branches of government is it given. We're going to give more to the education department. We're going to give more to the military. We're going to just raise taxes and give more to both. That sort of thing. Okay, Congress gets to decide where, when, and what the government spends money. Now, again, with all laws Congress passes, the president's ultimately going to have to sign the bill. So you do have to have some sort of agreement between different branches. But it's ultimately Congress's job to write the laws that determine where, when, and the money goes. Congress can coin money, which simply saying it can print money. It gets to regulate the value of money, and it's given the power to punish counterfeiters. So when we talk about federalism, we talked about, generally speaking, it is the state, not the federal government, that has what are called, quote unquote, police powers. Right? So power to arrest and to punish people. But the Constitution does give the federal government certain police powers, and one is to punish counterfeiters. After all, it's the federal government who controls all the money and makes the currency, creates the money, so the federal government is given the power to police that money supply and to catch and punish any people who are trying to counterfeit the money. So, continuing on with Congress's financial related powers, Congress can borrow money. Now, it usually does this by issuing bonds or notes. That's in effect the government issues, like a treasury bill or some type of security like that. And it's simple. They sell them often through banks. So you go to your bank and say, okay, I'd like to, I'll give you spend $100 today on a treasury bill. And what happens is it means they give you a fancy piece of paper, the bank does, and then you go back and you pay $100 for it today. You go back, you turn it in 10 years, and the bank, through money they get received from the federal government, pays $120, that sort of thing. All right, so basically you've made 2% interest a year. That's a big way America borrows money. So in effect, when people talk about America borrowing money, a lot of times we're just borrowing it from ourselves. We're borrowing it from ourselves and we want to pay it back to ourselves a few years down the line. However, it can also simply just borrow money from other countries or from other global financial institutions. All right. Everything I've mentioned so far has been an express power. Now let's talk about an implied power, the power to create a national bank. The case of McCulloch v. Maryland specifically set this out. Back in 1819, the Supreme Court said, yes, because Congress has to borrow money and coin money and spend money and raise money, it is necessary and proper for Congress to also create a national bank. And therefore, states are not allowed to try to destroy that bank or to try to tax that bank to death, which was essentially what Maryland was doing back in the early 1800s. All right, so McCulloch v. Maryland, very, very important case because it sets out, exactly how these implied powers work that we've been talking about. Very important case. Congress can also regulate commerce. Now, commerce just means business. Okay? So Congress can regulate commerce with foreign countries. All right, so they can set the rules like tariffs with goods coming in from China. It's all right. Any goods coming in from China, there's a 5% tariff charge on their value. So you basically, the people importing them have to pay 5% tax to import them. Okay, that's regulating commerce with other countries. But Congress also can regulate what is called interstate commerce. This is business between the states. All right, so this gives Congress, especially in this modern economy, lots and lots more power than it had 200 years ago. All right, because 200 years ago, people tended to kind of make their own stuff. They would often sew their own clothing. they would chop down trees and build their own log cabin. They would grow their own food, that sort of thing. And so the amount of interstate commerce, so business being done between the states, was much, much less, 250 years ago than it is today. So today, practically everything we touch, at least part of it was probably originating, if not from another country, then certainly from another state. And even if it was from another country, it's probably being brought into America in some other state than the state where you're living, using it, or buying that product. Okay? So because there's so much commerce, so many goods are made in one place and bought, either bought through Amazon, which has been shipped all over the country and delivered to your house, or, bought in big stores like Walmart, which, are being sent out from Walmart distribution centers, oftentimes from Arkansas, or being brought in on ships into various ports. Sometimes the Port of Houston's, I think, is actually the busiest port in America, but you certainly have ports on the West Coast, on the East Coast, New Orleans, all over the place. And so because anything you touch probably at some point was in a different state or a different country, this gives Congress a whole lot of power to basically regulate so many aspects of our lives now that they didn't have when this power was originally written. All right, so, if you hear people ever complain or just mention, that the federal government has gotten too big or has grown beyond what the founders intended, that may or may not be true. But it's part of it is just simply the effect of our modern economy. Where goods and services almost always travel between state lines to some extent. Certainly goods. Sometimes services too, but certainly goods. All right. That's Congress's power of the purse. But those are not the only powers Congress has. And even though the president is ultimately the commander-in-chief of the military, Congress does, in fact, have a lot of powers relating to the military and/or foreign policy. Okay, so again, Congress doesn't have the power of the sword specifically. That's left for the president or the executive branch. But Congress does oversee a lot of military issues. One, it's up to Congress's job to declare war. The president doesn't get to decide whether we go to war or not. Once we're in war, the president gets to make some military decisions. But it's not the president's duty or job to declare war. That's left for Congress. Now, in reality, this seems to have stopped happening. The last time America declared an actual war was World War II. So we're going on 80 years. Actually, it'll be 80 years this December. 1941 is the last time America declared war. Since then, Congress simply gives President the authorization to use military. They did this in the Korean War and Vietnam, more recently in the War on Terror. Congress simply tells the president, all right, fine, you have the authority to use the military in these places in this manner. Congress can raise an army and a navy. Now this leads to an implied power to also create an air force. Obviously, airplanes weren't in existence when the Constitution was written in 1787. So the Founding Fathers certainly didn't give Congress the power to create an air force. But after World War II, Congress did, in fact, create an air force. And no one really argues that Congress doesn't have that power. It's implied. Well, if Congress can create an army and a navy, and now we have this new invention called airplanes, well, certainly they can create a military force involving airplanes. And I guess this means Congress also has the power to create a space force. So we'll see what happens to this proposed space force in the future, but theoretically that would be another implied power from Congress. Next, getting away from the military strictly and going more to foreign affairs, Congress, or at least the Senate, has to ratify treaties. Ratify is just sort of means an official acceptance. So although it's the president's job to negotiate treaties with foreign countries. And a treaty is just sort of like a contract with another country. And the president and the executive branch, through whether it's through the Secretary of State or through ambassadors, negotiate treaties with other countries. The Senate has to approve them. So earlier I mentioned the different houses of Congress. The House of Representatives and the Senate have slightly different jobs. This is one of the things that the Senate does, but the House of Representatives is not involved in. The Senate has to approve treaties that the president negotiates. All right, so these last couple slides, I'm just going to touch on various other powers that don't fall within one of the categories we've talked about so far. Immigration rules, or as the Constitution talks about it, naturalization laws. Congress creates the laws regarding immigration. Congress establishes post offices. I don't have anything typed after that on the screen simply because I don't really know what else to say to that. It seems pretty clear. Congress can create post offices, and they in fact have. Patents and copyrights. All right, so if you don't know, a patent is basically what an inventor receives. All right, so if you invent a product, you file for what's called a patent, and you file it with the patent office in the federal government, and that basically says that you own that patent, and other people can't make goods with that exact same invention. All right? And a copyright is basically something you've written or drawn or recorded. Copyright involves singing, performances, things like that. And it gives you the right to those things you created. Someone can't copy your book or copy your song and sell it as their own. Okay, and all of these things added together are what we call intellectual property. And Congress is charged with the power to pass laws to protect intellectual property. And these are important because this encourages people to invest in new creations, new technology. Right? Because if you spend $1 million trying to develop some new technology, and then some other company could simply copy it the day after it was invented and start selling it for themselves, well, then why would you ever spend the time and money to come up with that new invention? You wouldn't. All right, so Congress passes laws to give people protections for their inventions, and this encourages people to make new and better inventions that hopefully improve our lives. All right, federal courts. As I think we mentioned when we initially talked about the different articles of the Constitution, the part of the Constitution that deals with federal courts is very, very short. And basically all it says is Congress will create a Supreme Court and whatever other federal courts are necessary. And so Congress has in fact created all the federal courts in the country, including the Supreme Court. And while we're talking about federal courts, this brings up another power that is reserved specifically for the Senate, which is to approve the president's judicial appointments. Okay? So all the federal judges are appointed by the president, and they have their jobs for life. And the president appoints these judicial appointments, but the president can't just simply pick and choose whoever he or she wants. Well, that's not true. He can, or she can, but they only become judges if the Senate approves them. Okay, so if the president just tried to, appoint his brother-in-law, who's never read a legal document in his life, then the Senate's probably not going to approve that brother-in-law to the court. All right, so the Senate has an important role in selecting or in determining which judges end up getting appointed to courts. Similarly, the Senate has to confirm and affirm a lot of other presidential appointments, all right, like ambassadors. Our ambassadors are basically the people who represent America in other countries. So America sends an ambassador to almost all, not all, but almost all the other countries in the world. And these are, again, presidential appointments. The president chooses who's supposed to be an ambassador to these countries, but the Senate has to approve them. Similarly, the president names a cabinet. All right, we're seeing this right now, the first couple months during Joe Biden's term in office, about once a week, once every other week, we'll see a story about how the Senate has approved, such and such a person to be a member of Joe Biden's cabinet. And a cabinet, on one hand, they're simply the president's advisors. That's how they started. but they have a lot of power because they oversee a lot of these sections or the departments of the executive branch, like the Department of Defense, the Department of Treasury, the State Department, that sort of thing. The president appoints people to head up those departments, and they become the president's advisors. However, again, the president gets to pick them, but the Senate has to confirm them. And for the most part, with some very rare exceptions, Congress almost always confirms a person the president is asked to serve in his cabinet. All right. Congress oversees Washington, D.C. Because Washington, D.C. is not a member of a state. Okay, it's a little city that sits between Virginia and Maryland. And although Washington, D.C. has a mayor and a city council, just like every other city does, it doesn't have a state to sit on top of it or to provide other laws and regulations, sort of like every other city. All right, so like Dallas has a mayor and city council, but Dallas is, in the middle of Texas. So the governor and the state legislature also makes laws that affect Dallas. D.C. is the same thing, except instead of having a governor in a state create laws for Washington, D.C., Congress does it. All right, the last thing we'll talk about today are checks and balances. Remember, all the branches check the branches and keep their power limited. All right. So the ways in which Congress checks and balances the other branches, there's a lot of them, but some of the ones we'll talk about or just mention is Congress can override the president's veto. Okay. If Congress passes a law, it doesn't become law automatically. The president has to sign it. If the president doesn't sign it, that's what's called a veto, V-E-T-O. And that's basically an attempt to sort of block that law. Okay, that's what a veto is. I don't like that law, it's not going to go into effect. However, if 2/3 of Congress votes again, after the president's veto, 2/3 of Congress again votes to approve that law, then the law will go into effect even over the president's veto. That's called overriding the veto. Okay. So this keeps the president from just simply, vetoing every law that gets passed. Finally, as we've seen here in recent years, the Congress, at least theoretically, has the power to impeach the president. Now, they've tried a few times. They have formally impeached the president on a few occasions. Andrew Johnson, right after the Civil War, Bill Clinton in the 90s, Donald Trump a couple times. But for that to actually mean the president leaves office, the Senate has to convict the president, and that has never actually happened. Mainly because it takes 2/3 of the Senate to vote to kick out the president. And the reason it's such a high standard is obvious. You don't want Congress kicking out the president every time they're of a different party. If you could simply kick out a president every time 51 of the senators were in a different party than the president, well, that wouldn't be fair. The people elected a president. You can't just get rid of him because you have 51 senators that don't like him. So it's really hard to impeach a president. It's only for certain types of crimes, and then only if 2/3 of the Senate thinks the president should be removed from office, which is why it's come close a couple times, but it's never actually happened. Other checks and balances of power that we've already talked about, the Congress has to affirm the president's appointments in his cabinet, ambassadors, and then judges. This is the way Congress keeps a check on both the executive branch and the judicial branch. The president gets to appoint judges, but Congress has to approve them. All right, so you don't get to become a federal judge unless Congress gives you the blessing. All right, so those are some of the check and balances powers, which are the last powers we will talk about in this lecture. So this kind of sums up what power and what responsibilities Congress has.